They say the most dangerous men never lose control, but no one ever warns you what happens when the one person who unsettles them has no idea they have done it. Adrian Cole had built his reputation on certainty. Every meeting ended the way he expected. Every negotiation followed the path he quietly designed long before anyone else entered the room. In Chicago, people rarely questioned his decisions because experience had taught them that Adrian always seemed to be 3 steps ahead. That was why he found himself driving across downtown on a rainy Thursday evening for a favor that should have taken less than 5 minutes. Ryan Bennett had called an hour earlier with an apology already filling his voice. A delayed flight had stranded him in New York, leaving his carefully arranged blind date waiting alone at a small Italian restaurant overlooking the river. Ryan hated disappointing people, especially when someone had agreed to meet him despite never seeing his face. Adrian had listened in silence before agreeing to stop by, deliver the apology, cover the dinner, leave. It was simple enough. The restaurant was warm against the cool October air, its windows glowing softly as city lights shimmered across the water outside. A hostess recognized Adrian immediately, though she wisely kept her surprise to herself. She simply guided him toward a quiet corner where a single table remained occupied. Ethan Parker sat by the window with both hands wrapped around a cup of untouched tea. There were no impatient sighs, no irritated messages flashing across his phone, no dramatic glances toward the entrance every few seconds. Instead, he quietly watched the rain trace gentle lines across the glass as though the evening itself deserved his attention more than the empty chair across from him. Adrian slowed without realizing it. He had expected annoyance. He had expected disappointment. Instead, he found calm. Ethan wore a simple navy sweater beneath a charcoal coat folded neatly over the back of his chair. A worn hardcover novel rested beside his plate, with several colorful bookmarks peeking from the pages. When a waitress approached to apologize for the delay once again, Ethan smiled with quiet gratitude and thanked her for checking in before assuring her he was perfectly fine. It was such an ordinary exchange that Adrian almost missed the strange feeling settling somewhere behind his ribs. He stepped closer. Ethan looked up immediately, offering a polite smile that carried neither excitement nor expectation. Adrian introduced himself and explained Ryan's unexpected business emergency, expecting frustration to finally appear. Instead, Ethan listened patiently until Adrian finished speaking. "I hope he's all right," Ethan said softly. "Travel can be unpredictable." Adrian blinked. "You're not upset?" Ethan glanced toward the empty chair before giving a small shrug. "A little disappointed, maybe. But disappointment doesn't become smaller just because you make someone else feel guilty." The answer caught Adrian completely off guard. He had spent years surrounded by people who measured every conversation by what they could gain from it. Ethan's words carried no hidden request, no complaint, no attempt to impress, just quiet honesty. Adrian cleared his throat. "Dinner has already been prepared. Ryan insisted I cover everything." Ethan smiled again. "Then I suppose letting perfectly good food go to waste would be the real tragedy." For reasons Adrian could not explain, he pulled out the empty chair instead of saying goodbye. They shared the meal without pretending it was anything more than 2 strangers having dinner. Ethan spoke about books, neighborhood libraries, and the children who raced each other to return borrowed novels every Saturday morning. Adrian found himself listening more than talking, something almost no one would have believed possible. Time slipped away unnoticed until dessert plates were quietly cleared from the table. When Ethan finally reached for his coat, Adrian realized nearly 2 hours had passed. Outside, the rain had stopped. Ethan thanked him for delivering Ryan's apology before picking up his book. As Adrian stood to leave, Ethan tilted his head ever so slightly and studied him with calm, thoughtful eyes. "You came because you're loyal to your friend," Ethan said. "But I don't think that's the only reason you stayed." Adrian searched for an answer that never came. Ethan offered one last gentle smile before walking toward the exit. Just before disappearing through the front door, he looked back once and said, "If we ever have dinner again, I hope it's because you chose the invitation yourself." Adrian expected the evening to disappear into memory the same way countless other favors had over the years. Yet by the time he reached his penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan, the quiet conversation at the restaurant refused to leave him alone. He loosened his tie, placed his keys on the marble counter, and walked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows where the city glittered beneath the night sky. Usually, the silence after work felt earned. Tonight it felt strangely crowded. His phone buzzed with messages from executives, attorneys, and trusted associates, but none of them held his attention for more than a few seconds. Every time he looked away, he found himself remembering the gentle smile Ethan had given the waitress, the patient way he had listened without interrupting, and the unexpected sentence that had followed him all the way home. "If we ever have dinner again, I hope it is because you chose the invitation yourself." Adrian frowned at his own reflection in the glass. He had negotiated multi-million-dollar agreements without hesitation, yet one quiet stranger had managed to leave him searching for words hours after the conversation had ended. The following morning, Mason Reed entered Adrian's office carrying the usual stack of reports. He immediately noticed that one document sat untouched while Adrian stared absently at the skyline. "Everything all right?" Mason asked carefully. Adrian nodded almost too quickly. "Perfectly fine." Mason accepted the answer, although years of working together told him otherwise. As he gathered another folder from the desk, something slipped onto the hardwood floor. It was a worn hardcover novel with several colorful bookmarks tucked between the pages. Adrian looked down, surprised. Ethan must have left it behind beside the dessert plate, and in the distraction of leaving the restaurant, Adrian had picked it up without realizing it. Mason bent to retrieve it before offering it back. "Should I have someone return this?" Adrian reached for the book, his fingers brushing the faded cover. For a brief moment, he considered saying yes. He employed enough people to solve simple problems like this without lifting a finger himself. Instead, he quietly answered, "No, I will take care of it." Mason raised one eyebrow, but wisely asked no further questions. Later that afternoon, Adrian searched the inside cover for an address. There was none, only a neatly written name and a small stamp from the Lincoln Park Community Library. By early evening, he found himself standing outside a modest brick building tucked between a neighborhood coffee shop and a family-owned bakery. Children laughed near the entrance while parents carried stacks of borrowed books toward the parking lot. It was peaceful in a way Adrian rarely experienced. He stepped inside, instantly surrounded by the comforting scent of paper, polished wood, and fresh coffee drifting from a small reading corner. Behind a front desk, Ethan was kneeling beside a young boy who looked close to 10 years old, patiently helping him tape the spine of a well-loved adventure novel. "Books deserve second chances," Ethan said with an encouraging smile. "Sometimes people do too." The child grinned before hurrying toward the shelves. Only then did Ethan stand and notice Adrian waiting quietly near the entrance with the forgotten novel in his hands. Surprise crossed Ethan's face, quickly replaced by genuine warmth rather than embarrassment. "You actually came," Ethan said softly. Adrian extended the book toward him. "You left this behind." Ethan accepted it carefully, running one hand across the worn cover as though greeting an old friend. Most people would have asked a courier to deliver it. Adrian met his eyes for a long moment before answering with complete honesty. "That would have been easier." Ethan smiled, his green eyes reflecting the late afternoon sunlight pouring through the library windows. "But you did not choose easy." For reasons Adrian could not explain. Hearing those words felt far more satisfying than closing any business deal he had completed that year. Over the next several days, Adrian discovered something deeply inconvenient about curiosity. It refused to follow schedules. Every morning began with board meetings, financial reports, and carefully planned conversations that shaped the future of companies across the city. Yet somewhere between every decision, his thoughts wandered back to a quiet neighborhood library tucked between a bakery and a coffee shop. By Friday afternoon, he had already found 3 different reasons to drive past the block, each one sounding perfectly reasonable until he admitted none of them had anything to do with business. Mason noticed long before Adrian said a word. As they stepped out of another meeting, Mason calmly asked, "Would you like me to arrange a donation to the library?" Adrian looked at him with mild surprise. "Why would you think that?" Mason smiled faintly. "Because this is the 3rd time this week you have asked me about literacy programs." Adrian answered with complete honesty. "Children deserve places like that." Mason accepted the explanation, although he suspected there was another reason hidden beneath it. Late that afternoon, Adrian parked outside the library again, carrying a cardboard box filled with brand new children's books that one of his publishing partners had recently donated. Ethan looked up from organizing returned novels and smiled the moment Adrian walked through the door. "You remembered us," he said warmly. Adrian placed the box on the front desk. "These belong here more than they belong in a warehouse." Several children immediately gathered around the colorful covers while Ethan thanked him with quiet sincerity rather than exaggerated excitement. Watching him interact with every child by name made Adrian realize something unexpected. Ethan never spoke to anyone as though they were less important than the person beside them. Whether he was greeting a retired teacher, helping a nervous teenager find a history book, or listening patiently to a little girl explain why dragons belonged in every story, he gave each conversation the same careful attention. It was a kind of strength Adrian rarely encountered. As the library grew quieter near closing time, Ethan invited Adrian to the small coffee shop next door. They sat beside the front window while the evening sunlight painted long shadows across the sidewalk. Ethan stirred his tea before looking directly at Adrian. "If we are going to keep accidentally meeting each other," he said with an amused smile, "we should probably agree on a few rules." Adrian leaned back with genuine interest. "I am listening." Ethan raised one finger. "First, do not investigate my personal life. If I want you to know something about me, I will tell you." Adrian nodded without hesitation. Ethan lifted a second finger. "Second, do not solve every problem by writing a check. Sometimes people need support more than they need money." Adrian accepted that one as well, although it challenged habits he had built over many years. Finally, Ethan raised a third finger. "Third, do not tell me what I should do simply because you are used to people following your instructions." Adrian could not help smiling. Very few people had ever spoken to him that way. Stranger still, he did not find it disrespectful. He found it refreshing. "Those are reasonable conditions," he answered. Ethan looked almost surprised. "You agreed faster than I expected." Adrian glanced toward the busy street outside before quietly admitting, "You are the first person in a very long time who has asked me for boundaries instead of favors." Ethan lowered his eyes for a moment, then smiled with unmistakable kindness. "Boundaries make trust easier, Adrian." That single sentence lingered in Adrian's mind long after they left the coffee shop. Later that evening, his phone rang. Ryan's cheerful voice came through the speaker. "I finally have a free weekend. I was thinking about calling Ethan and asking whether he would give me another chance." Adrian stood silently beside his apartment window, staring across the Chicago skyline until his reflection looked back at him. Without realizing how tightly he was gripping the crystal glass in his hand, he heard a sharp crack echo through the quiet room as a thin line spread across the surface. Ryan stopped speaking. "Adrian," he asked carefully, "are you still there?" Ryan laughed softly. On the other end of the call, completely unaware that the silence stretching between them carried far more weight than either of them expected. "You are still there, right?" he asked again. Adrian slowly set the cracked glass on the kitchen counter before answering in an even voice. "You should ask him yourself." Ryan sounded relieved. "That is exactly what I was hoping to hear. I owe him a proper evening after everything that happened." Adrian ended the conversation a few moments later, but the apartment no longer felt as quiet as it usually did. He kept replaying Ryan's words while staring at the city below. It was a perfectly reasonable plan. Ryan had been the one Ethan originally agreed to meet. There was nothing unfair about giving the blind date another chance. Even so, the thought settled heavily in Adrian's chest in a way he could not explain. Saturday arrived with clear blue skies and crisp autumn air. At the Lincoln Park Community Library, Ethan was arranging a display of classic novels when he noticed a familiar luxury sedan parked across the street. Adrian stepped inside, carrying 2 paper cups from the coffee shop next door. Ethan smiled with genuine surprise. "You are becoming a regular visitor." Adrian handed him one of the cups. The owner recommended the cinnamon latte. Ethan accepted it with both hands. "You remembered what I ordered." Adrian answered without thinking. "You always choose cinnamon when the weather turns colder." The words escaped before he realized how carefully he had been paying attention. Ethan looked at him for a second longer than usual before changing the subject. They spent the next hour helping volunteers organize a weekend reading event for local families. Adrian found himself assembling folding tables, carrying boxes of children's books, and listening as Ethan patiently encouraged every young reader who walked through the door. Nobody recognized the powerful businessman standing beside the librarian. To the children, he was simply the tall man who smiled awkwardly while helping them stack colorful storybooks. It was the most ordinary afternoon Adrian had experienced in years, and unexpectedly, it was becoming one of his favorites. Just after lunch, the front door opened again. Ryan Bennett stepped inside holding a bouquet of autumn flowers and wearing an apologetic expression. Ethan looked up first. Ryan. Ryan walked forward with an embarrassed smile. I finally made it to Chicago without another flight delay. I wanted to apologize in person. Adrian remained quietly beside one of the bookshelves, his expression unreadable. Ryan continued. If you are willing, I would love the chance to take you to dinner. This time I promise I will actually be there. Ethan glanced toward Adrian almost instinctively before looking back at Ryan. There was an uncomfortable silence that none of them seemed eager to break. Ryan noticed the glance and looked between the two men with growing curiosity. Did I interrupt something? Adrian answered calmly. No. Ethan folded his hands together thoughtfully. Ryan had done nothing wrong. In fact, he had come exactly as he promised, offering a sincere apology without excuses. After a long pause, Ethan finally nodded. Coffee would be nice. Dinner feels like too much pressure for two people who never actually met. Ryan's face brightened immediately. Coffee it is. Tomorrow afternoon. Ethan agreed with another small smile. Adrian thanked one of the volunteers for their help before quietly excusing himself. He walked toward the exit without offering an opinion because he knew he had no right to one. Outside, cool wind carried bright red leaves along the sidewalk as he paused beside his car. Before he could open the door, Ethan hurried out of the library behind him. Adrian. He turned. Ethan stopped a few feet away, breathing lightly from the quick walk. You are leaving awfully fast. Adrian offered a polite smile that did not quite reach his eyes. You have plans to make. Ethan studied him carefully, the same thoughtful expression he had worn during their very first dinner. Then he asked a question so gentle that it somehow struck deeper than any accusation could have. How much longer are you planning to stand outside my life instead of stepping into it? Adrian stood motionless for several seconds after Ethan's question, watching the breeze carry bright red leaves across the sidewalk between them. For years he had believed every difficult conversation could be solved with confidence, preparation, or careful timing. Yet standing outside the neighborhood library, none of those strengths seemed useful. Ethan was not asking for promises. He was asking for honesty. Adrian finally drew a slow breath. I am not used to stepping into places where I cannot predict the outcome, he admitted. Ethan's expression softened. Neither am I. A quiet smile appeared between them, small but genuine, and somehow it felt more meaningful than any victory Adrian had celebrated in a boardroom. Then maybe we both practice, Ethan replied. Before Adrian could answer, several children burst through the library doors laughing as they raced toward waiting parents. The ordinary moment dissolved the tension, and Ethan excused himself to help lock up for the evening. Adrian watched him disappear inside before returning to his car, carrying a feeling he had never experienced before. It was not uncertainty about business. It was uncertainty about himself. The next afternoon, Ryan arrived at the coffee shop exactly on time. Adrian had no intention of being anywhere nearby, yet despite telling himself otherwise, he found his car parked half a block away with a clear view of the entrance. He remained inside, telling himself he was simply passing through the neighborhood. Nearly 20 minutes later, he saw Ethan and Ryan seated by the front window, talking comfortably over steaming mugs. Ryan laughed at something Ethan said, and Ethan answered with one of those quiet smiles Adrian had come to recognize almost immediately. Instead of jealousy, what surprised Adrian most was disappointment in himself. Ethan had every right to enjoy another conversation. They had never agreed to anything beyond friendship. Even so, Adrian started the engine and drove away before the meeting ended. Meanwhile, inside the coffee shop, Ryan gradually realized something unexpected. Ethan answered every question kindly, yet his attention drifted toward the window every few minutes, as though waiting for someone who never appeared. Finally, Ryan set down his cup. Can I ask you something honestly? Ethan nodded. When Adrian came to apologize that night, did something happen between the two of you? Ethan looked down at the swirling foam in his latte before answering with complete sincerity. Nothing happened. That is probably why it matters. Ryan blinked, confused. Ethan continued with a gentle smile. He never tried to impress me. He never asked me to admire him. He simply stayed. Ryan leaned back quietly. The answer explained more than he expected. When the conversation ended an hour later, Ryan walked Ethan toward the library. Before saying goodbye, he stopped beneath a maple tree whose golden leaves floated gently around them. "I think I understand now," Ryan said with a warm laugh. Ethan tilted his head. "Understand what?" Ryan smiled. "You were never waiting for me to arrive that first night." Ethan looked surprised. Ryan continued. "You were waiting for someone willing to choose the chair across from you without being told to." Ethan did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked across the quiet street, where the afternoon sunlight reflected from the windows of nearby buildings. Deep inside, he knew Ryan was right. Across the city, Adrian sat alone in his office reviewing documents that normally demanded his complete attention. Instead, his eyes remained fixed on the same paragraph for nearly 10 minutes without reading a single word. A folder rested unopened beside his hand, delivered that morning by one of his legal advisors. It contained financial records concerning several charitable organizations throughout Chicago, including one that helped fund the Lincoln Park Community Library. Adrian finally opened the folder, unaware that a single unfamiliar company name printed near the bottom of the page was quietly beginning a chain of events that would soon draw both his world and Ethan's together in ways neither of them could yet imagine. The unfamiliar company name refused to leave Adrian's mind. He had reviewed thousands of financial reports throughout his career, and experience had taught him that numbers often revealed intentions long before people did. The foundation listed on the final page had recently become the primary sponsor of several neighborhood education programs, including the Lincoln Park Community Library. On paper, everything appeared perfectly legitimate. Even so, something about the sudden flow of money into small community projects felt carefully staged rather than naturally developed. Early Monday morning, Adrian asked Mason to gather only publicly available information about the organization. Nothing beyond public records, Adrian added before Mason could misunderstand the request. "I promised someone I would respect boundaries." Mason nodded, though he silently wondered when Adrian had begun measuring his business decisions against personal promises. By lunchtime, the report arrived. The foundation itself appeared respectable, but nearly every large donation could be traced back to a consulting company called Shaw Civic Development. Adrian recognized the name immediately. Victor Shaw had spent years presenting himself as a generous businessman while quietly positioning himself near projects that later became profitable commercial properties. Adrian leaned back in his chair. "Interesting," he murmured. That evening, he walked into the library carrying no gifts and no convenient excuse. Ethan was sitting alone at one of the long wooden tables surrounded by spreadsheets, handwritten notes, and folders filled with budget reports. He looked up with a tired smile. "You picked an exciting night to visit. I am trying to make numbers behave." Adrian glanced at the papers. "Annual budget?" Ethan nodded. "The library board asked me to help organize next year's funding reports. I used to work as a research assistant for a legal consulting firm before I decided I preferred books over conference rooms." Adrian looked genuinely surprised. "You never mentioned that." Ethan smiled softly. "You never asked." Adrian pulled out the chair across from him. "May I?" Ethan nodded. For the next hour, they quietly reviewed grant summaries together. Adrian noticed something remarkable. Ethan did not simply read financial documents. He questioned patterns, compared dates, and circled small inconsistencies most people would have ignored. At one point, Ethan stopped writing and frowned at a page from the newest sponsorship agreement. "That is odd." Adrian looked over. "What is?" Ethan pointed to a sequence of transfers. "The donations increase every time another neighborhood property changes ownership nearby. Libraries usually receive steady community support, not funding that rises and falls with commercial development. It might mean nothing, but it is unusual." Adrian felt an unexpected chill despite the warm room. Ethan had reached the same conclusion without knowing anything about Victor Shaw. "You noticed that from one report?" Ethan shrugged modestly. "Patterns tell stories. Books taught me that." Before Adrian could respond, Ethan gathered several older financial statements from a nearby cabinet and placed them beside the newer reports. Within minutes, he highlighted another inconsistency. "Look here. The addresses connected to these donations are changing, but the mailing contact remains exactly the same. Whoever prepared these records wanted people to notice the donors, but not the administrator." Adrian stared at the highlighted pages. He suddenly understood why Ethan had once worked in legal research. His quiet nature concealed an exceptionally disciplined mind. Ethan looked up, noticing Adrian's thoughtful expression. "Did I say something wrong?" Adrian slowly shook his head. "No. You noticed something that experienced auditors sometimes miss." Ethan laughed lightly. "I just enjoy puzzles." As they packed away the folders, Ethan hesitated before speaking again. "There is one more thing." Adrian waited. "Earlier today, someone called the library asking unusual questions about me. They wanted to know how long I had worked here and whether I often stayed after closing." Adrian's expression immediately grew serious, but he remembered Ethan's rules before saying anything. "Did they leave a name?" Ethan shook his head. "No. It could have been completely harmless. I only remembered because the questions felt strangely specific." Adrian walked Ethan to the library entrance after closing. The street outside looked peaceful, illuminated by warm storefront lights and the fading colors of sunset. Ethan smiled as he locked the front door. "You are thinking too hard again." Adrian met his eyes. "Perhaps." Ethan adjusted the strap of his shoulder bag. "Then promise me one thing." Adrian nodded. "Do not solve this by assuming the worst about everyone." Adrian gave the only answer he could honestly offer. "I will solve it with the truth." As Ethan walked toward the nearby train station, Adrian remained where he was, watching until Ethan disappeared around the corner. For the first time, the investigation was no longer about suspicious financial records. Somewhere behind those documents, someone had already begun paying attention to Ethan, and Adrian knew with absolute certainty that whatever story those numbers were hiding had just become deeply personal. The conversation outside the library stayed with Ethan long after he reached home. Adrian had not promised impossible things, nor had he offered empty reassurance. He had simply said he would follow the truth wherever it led. That answer sounded strangely comforting because it felt honest. The next morning, the library opened as usual. Parents returned children's books, college students searched for quiet study tables, and retirees gathered near the reading corner with fresh coffee. Everything appeared perfectly ordinary until Ethan noticed the same unfamiliar man sitting near the local history shelves for the second day in a row. He was polite, never disruptive, and always left without borrowing a single book. Ethan did not assume the worst, but years of quietly observing people had taught him that repeated patterns rarely happened by accident. Instead of confronting the visitor, he wrote down the time of each appearance in a small notebook he kept behind the front desk. Later that afternoon, Adrian received another public records report from Mason. Every transaction connected to Shaw Civic Development appeared legal on its own, yet together they formed an unusually precise pattern. Community organizations first received generous donations. Nearby properties quietly changed ownership months later, and commercial redevelopment followed shortly afterward. The Lincoln Park Community Library now sat almost exactly in the center of one of those. Expanding investment zones. Adrian closed the folder and immediately remembered Ethan pointing to the same irregular timing without access to any confidential information. It was not luck. Ethan simply saw details other people overlooked. Instead of calling lawyers or investigators, Adrian drove to the library after work. He found Ethan replacing books on the upper shelves while humming softly to himself. "You came back," Ethan said with an easy smile. Adrian returned the smile. "I wanted to ask whether you had noticed anything unusual since we last talked." Ethan stepped down from the ladder and thought for a moment. "Nothing dramatic, just small things that feel out of place." He described the unfamiliar visitor who kept returning without reading, the anonymous telephone questions, and 2 letters offering to purchase the building on behalf of unnamed investors. Adrian listened without interrupting. When Ethan finished, he folded his arms thoughtfully. "Those details matter." Ethan tilted his head. "I know they matter. I just do not know why." Adrian considered revealing everything he had discovered about Shaw Civic Development, but he stopped himself. Ethan had asked for honesty, not control. "Would you be willing to look at something for me?" Adrian asked. Ethan agreed immediately. The following evening, they met in a quiet conference room at Adrian's downtown office. Ethan looked slightly amused by the elegant surroundings. "This might be the first office where the coffee machine costs more than my car." Adrian laughed, surprising both of them. He placed several publicly available financial reports across the table. "Tell me what you see." Ethan spent nearly 40 minutes studying the documents in complete silence. Adrian never rushed him. Finally, Ethan circled 3 addresses with a blue pen. These companies are pretending to be independent donors, but they all share the same administrative network. Someone wants local organizations to trust familiar names, while a single group quietly coordinates everything behind the scenes. Adrian looked at him with unmistakable admiration. That is exactly what my analysts concluded. Ethan blinked. Then why ask me? Adrian answered without hesitation. Because I wanted to know whether you would reach the same conclusion without anyone leading you there. Ethan leaned back slowly. You were testing my judgment. Adrian shook his head. No, I was confirming my own. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Ethan noticed another folder resting unopened beside Adrian's hand. There is something else, he said quietly. Adrian looked surprised. How did you know? Ethan smiled faintly. You keep glancing at that folder every few minutes. Whatever is inside worries you more than these reports. Adrian opened it at last. Inside was an invitation to a citywide charity gala hosted by Victor Shaw, where business leaders, nonprofit directors, and major donors would all attend under one roof. Adrian placed the invitation between them. If these financial connections are real, everyone involved will be there. Ethan read the elegant card before looking back at Adrian. Instead of appearing intimidated, he looked thoughtful. Then maybe that is exactly where we should start looking. Adrian instinctively opened his mouth to object before remembering the 3 rules Ethan had given him over coffee. He could not tell Ethan what to do simply because he wanted to protect him. Ethan noticed the hesitation and smiled knowingly. You almost forgot rule number 3. Adrian exhaled with quiet amusement. I did. Ethan folded the invitation and handed it back. Then do not tell me to stay away. Adrian met his calm green eyes and realized the greatest challenge before him was no longer uncovering Victor Shaw's plans. It was learning to trust the quiet man sitting across the table, because somewhere along the way Ethan Parker had stopped becoming someone Adrian wanted to protect and had become someone whose judgment he trusted almost as much as his own. The invitation arrived 3 days later in a heavy cream envelope embossed with gold lettering. The annual Shaw Foundation Charity Gala had long been considered one of Chicago's most influential fundraising events, attracting business leaders, nonprofit directors, educators, and city officials under the same roof. Ethan turned the card over several times while standing behind the library desk. I still think it feels strange, he admitted quietly. Adrian stood across from him, his expression thoughtful rather than dismissive. You do not have to go. Ethan looked up immediately. That sounded very close to telling me what to do. Adrian smiled despite himself. You are right. Let me try again. If you choose to attend, I will respect that decision. Ethan folded the invitation and slipped it into his notebook. Then I choose to go. Adrian nodded once. Then I will be there too. During the following week, Ethan spent every spare moment reviewing publicly available reports connected to the foundation. The more he read, the more one detail continued to bother him. The names of the donors changed constantly, yet the legal language inside dozens of agreements remained almost identical. It was as though different organizations had been assembled from the same blueprint. Ethan highlighted every repeated phrase before carrying the documents to Adrian's office. Adrian studied the marked pages carefully before looking back at Ethan with unmistakable respect. My legal department reviewed these for months. You found the pattern in 4 days. Ethan smiled modestly. Books teach people how to notice repeated stories. Contracts are not that different. Adrian laughed softly. You continue to surprise me. The evening of the gala arrived beneath a clear autumn sky. The downtown hotel shimmered with elegant lights while photographers welcomed distinguished guests onto a polished marble entrance. Ethan wore a simple dark navy suit that fit perfectly without drawing unnecessary attention. Adrian, dressed in a charcoal tuxedo, met him just inside the lobby. For a brief second, neither of them spoke. Ethan finally broke the silence. You clean up nicely. Adrian answered with a smile that only Ethan seemed capable of bringing out. So do you. They entered the ballroom together without announcing themselves as anything more than 2 guests attending the same event. Soft music drifted through the room while nonprofit representatives described community programs and local businesses discussed future partnerships. Ethan listened far more than he spoke. Every few minutes, he quietly observed another conversation, another exchange of business cards, another donor introducing himself to people he claimed to support. Adrian recognized the familiar look in Ethan's eyes. He was collecting details one small piece at a time. Nearly an hour later, Victor Shaw finally approached them with polished confidence and effortless charm. "Adrian," he said warmly, extending his hand. "It has been too long." Adrian greeted him politely before Victor turned toward Ethan. "And you must be the librarian everyone keeps talking about. I hear you have become interested in community development." Ethan returned the greeting with calm courtesy. "I am interested in understanding how communities grow." Victor smiled. "A worthy goal." The conversation remained pleasant, yet Ethan noticed something unusual almost immediately. Every time Victor spoke about supporting neighborhood education, he referred to buildings instead of readers, locations instead of programs, and investments instead of families. His vocabulary revealed priorities his prepared speeches tried to hide. As Victor excused himself to greet another guest, Ethan quietly turned toward Adrian. "He never once mentioned children." Adrian looked surprised. "What do you mean?" Ethan kept his voice low. "He spoke about libraries 6 different times, but not once did he mention the people who actually use them. He is interested in properties, not communities." Adrian followed Victor across the crowded ballroom with new understanding. Ethan had identified something no financial report could fully explain. The numbers suggested a pattern, but Victor's own words revealed the motive behind it. A short while later, Ethan wandered toward an information display featuring the Foundation's redevelopment projects. While studying one of the presentation boards, he noticed a familiar face speaking quietly with Victor near a side corridor. It was the same man who had spent several afternoons sitting inside the library without borrowing a single book. Ethan remained perfectly still until the man walked away, then memorized the name printed on the conference badge, clipped to his jacket. When Adrian joined him moments later, Ethan pointed discreetly toward the departing guest. "That is the visitor I told you about." Adrian looked across the room, his expression immediately sharpening with recognition. The name on the badge belonged not to an employee of the Foundation, but to a senior consultant working directly for Shaw Civic Development. Ethan slowly folded the event program in his hands. He was never interested in books. Adrian met Ethan's eyes, realizing the quiet observations that had begun inside a neighborhood library had now uncovered the first undeniable connection between Victor's organization and the people watching Ethan. The story they had been trying to understand was finally beginning to reveal itself, and neither of them could pretend it was only about financial records anymore. The days following the gala moved with surprising speed. Once the connection between the consultant and Shaw Civic Development had been confirmed, Adrian instructed his legal team to review every publicly available document connected to the redevelopment projects without crossing any legal or ethical boundaries. Ethan continued doing the same from the library, comparing historical property records, grant reports, and city planning documents one page at a time. Neither of them tried to rush the process because both understood that the truth became stronger when every piece fit together naturally. By the end of the week, they had assembled a timeline showing that several neighborhood organizations had unknowingly been used to increase the value of nearby commercial properties before ownership quietly changed hands. The library itself had become part of that pattern, not because anyone inside had done anything wrong, but because its growing popularity had made the surrounding neighborhood more attractive to investors. Adrian looked across the conference table at Ethan with unmistakable admiration. "Without your observations, I would have seen a business strategy. You helped me see the people affected by it." Ethan smiled gently. "And without you, I would never have known where to start looking." Together, they submitted the complete collection of public records and financial analyses to the appropriate city oversight authorities, allowing the information to be reviewed through official channels instead of private influence. Adrian knew there were faster ways to protect his own interests, but every one of those methods would have violated the promise he had silently made to Ethan. For the first time in many years, he chose patience over control because he understood that trust could not be built through power alone. Several weeks later, the city announced an independent review of multiple redevelopment projects, and several proposed property transfers were temporarily paused while additional documentation was requested. The Lincoln Park Community Library remained open, its funding protected while the review continued. Ethan stood inside the familiar building one quiet afternoon, watching children gather for story hour, when Adrian walked through the front doors carrying nothing except a folded newspaper. He placed it gently on the circulation desk. The headline described the city's decision to preserve several community institutions while reviewing commercial development proposals. Ethan read the article before looking back at Adrian with relief shining quietly in his eyes. It worked. Adrian nodded. The truth finally had enough people listening. Ethan closed the newspaper and laughed softly. You know what is strange? Adrian raised an eyebrow. The first night we met, I thought you were simply delivering someone else's apology. Adrian smiled. I thought I was delivering one too. They both laughed, remembering how impossible it would have seemed that a missed blind date would eventually lead them here. A few days later, Ryan invited both of them to dinner, insisting that he owed them more than one apology. During dessert, he finally admitted something he had never intended to reveal. There is something I should confess, he said with an embarrassed smile. The night I asked Adrian to visit the restaurant, my flight had not actually been delayed yet. I could have made it if I had wanted to. I asked Adrian to go because I had a feeling the two of you would understand each other better then. Either of you understood yourselves. Adrian stared at his longtime friend in disbelief before slowly shaking his head with reluctant amusement. Ethan laughed so hard that nearby diners turned to look. So the first meeting was not entirely an accident. Ryan grinned. Only the part where neither of you realized it. Months passed, and spring gradually replaced the last traces of winter. The library launched an expanded literacy program supported by transparent community grants and local volunteers. Adrian attended the opening ceremony without standing at the front of the room or asking anyone to recognize his contribution. He spent most of the afternoon helping children arrange bookshelves while Ethan greeted families arriving through the front doors. As the celebration ended, Adrian asked Ethan whether he would like to take a walk before dinner. Ethan agreed immediately. They found themselves back at the same Italian restaurant overlooking the river where everything had quietly begun. The hostess smiled as she seated them beside the familiar window. This time there was no empty chair waiting for another guest, no awkward explanation, and no misunderstanding. Only two people who had chosen to be there together. Adrian reached into his jacket and carefully placed Ethan's well-worn novel on the table. You forgot this once, he said quietly. I think it changed my life. Ethan rested one hand gently on the cover before looking into Adrian's eyes. You came that first night because your friend asked you to. Adrian nodded. I know. Ethan smiled. Why are you here tonight? Adrian answered without hesitation. Because there is nowhere else I would rather be. Silence settled comfortably between them as the evening lights reflected across the river outside. After a long moment, Ethan reached across the table and placed his hand beside Adrian's. Adrian did not move immediately. He remembered every lesson Ethan had taught him about patience, respect, and choice. Only when Ethan quietly turned his hand over did Adrian gently hold it. Ethan smiled with the same quiet warmth that had first captured Adrian's attention months before. This feels like our first real date, he whispered. Adrian smiled back. I have been looking forward to it since the night I almost walked away after delivering someone else's apology.